Welcome to the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. Each week, we talk with accomplished content strategy experts to share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 28 of the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. I'm really happy today to have with us Jamie Schmid. Jamie is a Portland-based web developer, designer. She's active in the WordPress world. She works for Sitelock, the security website security company, as an outreach evangelist. And I'll let Jamie tell you a little bit more about her background and what she's up to.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you for having me. So I describe myself as a content enthusiast, and that came about in a meandering sort of way, which I think is actually a great way for it to come about. But I started my career as an illustrator in the late-ish 2000s. And I thought that my whole life was just going to be illustration. And I was working at a toy company when the role of website manager was added to my workload. And it was my first time using a CMS. It was Typo 3 and Xcart, and I had no idea at that point you could do such a thing with websites. My experience with web development was building some handmade HTML websites in the late 90s, where I was literally calculating pixels so that I could make Mystery Meat navigation with image maps. So I had a much different idea of how websites worked, and then 10 years later, it turns out it was completely different. But in that role, I was often frustrated with the things that I was not able to do. There was a lot of going back and forth between the agency and asking them to make some content edits or, just real basic things that I felt in my very limited experience with web development that I should be able to do. And I realized that I wanted to do that. I wanted to do what those developers on that end were doing. And I sort of carried that initial frustration of not being able to do the things that I wanted throughout my entire career. And I kind of started with accessibility, then UX, and then information architecture, and eventually I focused on the CMS author experience, which is exactly what I was experiencing. And eventually I found there was a word for it, and there were people that were talking about this. And that's when I saw Karen McGrain speak for the first time at DrupalCon 2013. And that pretty much changed everything for me. And my direction became more sort of dedicated to making sure that users of my website, the CMS website that I was building, had the tools that they needed to be able to do what they needed to do.
Well, that's interesting. So you have, just a quick aside, I just want to observe that everybody I've talked to has a unique pathway into this racket. And yours is, again, unique. And I love that it was Karen McGrain was the catalyst, because she's been the catalyst for a lot of people, I think, and getting their ideas set around content. And I don't think you would identify specifically as a content strategist, but you've done more recently, since about that era you just mentioned, you've done a lot of independent design development and site building for clients of various kinds. And content has been the core of that. I know when I hear you, I first, the way I met Jamie was she did a talk at WordCamp Seattle last fall. And she was just so excited about content and about how to do it right and how to, pry it out of clients or, whatever you needed to do to get a hold of it. And and I think you exemplify a big class of people in that world, like the WordPress and Joomla and Drupal and other worlds of people who would identify mostly as a designer, developer, maybe dev designer or an agency head or something like that. But you realize very quickly that content is right at the core of that. Another thing that Karen McGrain has said is that content is the gift. The code is the design or the wrapping, but the gift is the content. Was that sort of your, does that accurately describe kind of your attitude towards content?
Yeah. And you're exactly right about how I sort of arrived at that point. It's because I was originally a developer, and I was one of those developers that kind of sat in my corner and took the instructions that came down for me and built those things that I was given to build. But a lot of times I was noticing that when I failed to ask the questions that I had in my head, that those things eventually became issues further on in the process. So then I learned I just need to talk to the designer. I need to talk to the project manager, even if I can talk to the client, to actually learn why certain decisions were made. And that opened the whole world up, because now I was talking with, I was learning intent, and I was learning like goals of things, and a lot of things ironed out much easier. I wasn't having to rebuild things nearly as much. And then that eventually led to the content phase, which, like a lot of places, was the very last thing that we did on the website. A lot of times it would be like, all right, the site's done, now give us content. And I wasn't immediately aware of that issue, because I had amazing project managers that kept that away from me as the developer. But sometimes, as I, at my old company, Acedia, back in Wisconsin, as my role sort of grew, I was taking on projects sort of from beginning to end. So I was talking with these clients, and I was managing this content. And I quickly saw that there was a big problem there. When, 2 weeks before launch, I was getting, all these emails of use this, oh no, wait, use this here, or like a folder full of untitled images that are like, use the photo of Janet in front of the tree, that's something that happens, or sometimes I would get mailed a CDR of a brochure, and this was all happening at the last minute. And on top of that, at this content entry stage, clients were a lot of times discovering that the site that we had built for them, the structure we had in place, wasn't fitting what their content actually was. And in the past, I know it's easier to just say, just fit it in, or even giving the client this sort of sense of duty that they have to make their content fit into this structure. And I realized pretty quickly that starting the content phase much earlier means that I can structure content better. I can build a much better site that is as flexible as it needs to be, because we're now thinking about content in the beginning. And that also helped sort of communicate to the client that content is actually a process, and it's going to be much bigger than you expect it to be. And as the web professional, I personally feel it's my role to guide the client in that phase, because they don't know about that probably any more than they know about building the website that I'm building.
Right.
So,
a couple things there were two things in there that interested me. One, a lot of everything you've just been talking about kind of points to the importance of planning and having a process and having that content in there as quick as possible. But right at the very start, you were talking about how important intent and the why is. And how far has that moved up in your process? Are you more attentive, and do you have like kind of ways of assessing that intent and kind of, because I know everything is easier when you have this kind of top level vision that everything falls under like an umbrella. How has that manifested that kind of why and intent?
So since I've been working freelance for the past 6 years before I joined Sitelock. So I was doing sites from beginning to end, and that's when I was the project manager role. I was doing the discovery process. So I was able to talk with clients directly. And the why starts, right away when your design or discovery process, it has to start with why, because that is going to inform every decision you're going to make. It's going to inform the type of website. It's going to inform the design, and, so much. So I ask why a lot. And I almost sometimes joke that I'm like a 5-year-old that anytime you tell them something, they want to know why. And it's not because I'm just nosy or I want to be annoying. It's because it will help build a better product, experience, right, business in the end.
Well, there's a couple things about that. First, I think you've probably seen that Simon Sinek video about the importance of why. He says that people don't buy what you do or how you do it; they buy why you do it. And he uses the example of like Apple and Martin Luther King and people like that. But it talks about like Apple is like, you buy our products because you think different. You need an Apple. That's sort of that kind. There's that kind of why. But then there's also like, what's your business intention? Are you selling stuff? Are you just gathering leads? Are you a publisher? Are you an affiliate? How do you elicit all those? And there's other kinds of why that motivates people. How, like values that drive people, and identifying those can be important. How systematic, I guess, are you about identifying those different kinds of why?
Well, a lot of times, clients, or even when I'm working in an agency, and designers and whoever I'm working with thinks that they need something, but it's really the thing that they think they need isn't necessarily the solution that's going to fix what it is exactly that they need to accomplish. So sometimes they'll think that we need to build out so-and-so and build it out in a certain way. And I'll be like, wait, why do we need this tool? How is it going to be used? What is what do you eventually want to do with it? And a lot of times it turns out there's a different way to go about it that's simpler or more complex. So, I'm asking why at every stage. I'm asking why in the discovery stage. What goals, asking in the design stage. Like, they can tell me, like, I love these 2 websites, right? And I could just copy them, but I could also say, why do you like them? Like, what about this do you like? Because I'm building them their own solution, and it's not gonna, their solution is absolutely not going to be exactly the website that they like, maybe because of the color, but maybe it turns out they like it because it's organized in a way that subconsciously they really have a lot of success in navigating compared to their current site. So, and then of course, just as a base discovery process, I have a list of things that helps me kind of talk to people and figure out what they're trying to do.
Well, I love that it doesn't end there, though, that you said you're asking why throughout the process, and that how have you does that? I'm just curious about that, because does that loop get shorter with your experience? Because some of the things, like as you do this more and more, some things that used to slip by, or like you're asking why earlier in the process, does that?
Yes, it absolutely did. I'm able to ask better, more targeted questions. I'm able to get to the core of the problem a lot faster now than I used to be. And those that comes with experience. It's not something you can really immediately expect to be a quick process.
Right, and no matter how good you get at it, somebody will throw you a curveball and you'll have a new why.
That's what makes it so fun.
Exactly, yeah. Hey, one other thing we talked about earlier, I can't remember when we talked, but anyhow, there's this discovery that you made pretty early on in your consulting career, that you're really, when you do a project like a WordPress site or a Drupal site or something like that, you're really designing 2 websites. You're designing that end user website with the information you're publishing, but you're also maybe equally or maybe even more importantly, building an administrative user experience that is creating the work environment for the content creators and managers. Tell me a little bit more about your discoveries there and how you work that into your process.
So one of the things that I do, one of the ways that I sort of express my own feelings of how important that is I create the architecture of a site in the admin before I start building the front end of it, and I train the client on the content entry. So people have different opinions on this phase, and depending on the CMS you're using, it's not always as easy, but I like to get the clients thinking about content while I'm building out the front end of the website. So they're trained right away on entering the content. They have these, the structure that we have identified in the wireframes, and maybe even into the design that it should be structured this way. But now they're working on a staging site while I'm working locally, typically, and they're entering content. So they're seeing right away that this doesn't fit. And I make sure to say, If it doesn't fit, if there's a problem, don't try to make it fit. Let me know. It's super easy for us to change it at this point. And then as an added bonus, I'm able to pull down database content of their real content as they're having it. As anybody has ever been a designer or a developer knows, having real content to work with is like the dream. It doesn't always work out that way because of the way the process typically goes. But I'm well aware that, this is the website that my client is going to be using. And then I'm also designing the site that their users are going to be using. And those two are always going to be very different.
Mm-hmm. How extensive do you customize things at the back end? I'm trying to think, and this kind of gets into the other thing I want to talk to you about probably, is this notion of structured content and how you kind of design your content, structure it for end use, but also use in the data entry and the earlier process. Tell me a little bit about the relationship between those, I guess.
In about midway into my web career, I was working for a small agency, and we did mostly small websites, but I started to notice that when we got larger websites, it sort of turned into chaos. And I was like, there's something that I don't understand. There's something I'm not seeing here that I don't know. And then that's when I learned the term information architecture. And I left that job and went back to school to University of Milwaukee for information architecture. They have an amazing library science department there. And I was able to concentrate on that and more specifically a digital sort of context. So that, really it sort of changed things for me, where I was now, I was thinking 3 steps ahead compared to what I used to be when I was just designing and I'm like, this needs to look good. I was now thinking about content types, relationships between content types, reusing content rather than, replicating it. And this is before I was even using any sort of API kind of thing, before I was even really mobile wasn't even responsive at that point. But learning the relationships and things, and this is when I eventually moved to WordPress, and I discovered that WordPress actually is very, very powerful. It's built in a way that you're able to do really powerful things with content. As so is Drupal for sure. But WordPress, it was something I didn't realize that it had those capabilities until I started working with it more closely.
Right.
So.
Yeah, no, and that's interesting because I came to work. Well, I used to build websites by hand, and then CMSs by hand, and then got into Drupal a little bit, and then got into WordPress. And at first, when I got into WordPress, I was like, good Lord, the underlying information architecture just defied everything I knew about relational databases and entity relationship diagrams and kind of how everything worked. But at the user level, and user meaning both the designers, developers building the sites as well as the end user, it works just fine. It works out great. And I'm still 10 years later trying to get my head around that. But yeah.
I agree.
Yeah, but it's interesting that there's some juju magic thing there about WordPress that even with what a Drupal, because I have a lot of Drupal friends who are and other friends who are not snobs, but they're like, well, you need a properly designed relational database. I'm like, nah, I'm pretty sure you don't. You can power 1/3 of the web without it.
I mean, to be fair, WordPress's database is designed in a proper relational way. It's not huge because the way that to get a little technical, the way that we think of content types is really everything is a post. Some posts are hierarchical, some posts are non-hierarchical, and each of those two content types have different characteristics that allow them to interact in different ways. But you can tell one to behave with some characteristics that are only attributed to the other one. So the more that you learn about it and the more you understand it, which is why when I talk I've done a few specific like WordPress content modeling talks where I get much more into those specifics. And I think that it can be very confusing for people, and I think that they don't necessarily want to learn it because it seems like something that as a user is too complex. And so my goal there is to show that it's not all that complex when you understand it, and when it's explained to you in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I get what you're talking about there. So it's sort of like at the end user level, like people get immediately like a different content type, like an event versus a post versus a page about something versus a bio or, whatever it is. So conceptually they get it, but how do you stitch that together between the administrative user and the end user? And
so you just made me think of something. When I say end user, I'm talking about my editor.
Okay.
So
I thought that might be the case.
Content, yes.
Okay.
My end user is different from their end user. That's sort of how I think of it. I'm also building the site that their end user is going to use, but my end user is my client.
Got it. Let me ask you about that. This occurred to me a few minutes ago when you were talking about, like, I've seen so many CMS implementations where the developers just go off and build it, and then they come in and train you how to use it. Like, your process is entirely different from that. Are you interacting with as much? It sounds like you try to interact with the content creators and managers as early and often as possible. Is that?
So as I was saying, my experience at the toy company, that was frustrating. But then after I went to school for web development and started getting out into the world, my first site was a Joomla site, and I was working for a nonprofit that had a lot of volunteers, and it had a large turnaround of volunteers. And so I built this site in Joomla, and I probably wasn't building it in the best way that a very seasoned Joomla developer nowadays would build it. This is back in like maybe 2010, 2009 maybe. But I had to train every person to use that Joomla site. And this isn't a thing against Joomla, but I learned from that. And I learned that I don't want to have to spend my time training new people and creating all this complex documentation and making it. What I was always sort of on the lookout for was a way to build a back end of a site that is just intuitive. It makes sense. You don't have to go around looking for things. So then in between there, I was working with Drupal, and that even sort of furthered my resolve to find something that was more intuitive. So then when I got to WordPress, specifically when I learned about custom fields, advanced custom fields, I learned about customizing the admin panel. And then, so I had a little bit of a background of information architecture. So I knew about things like how important labeling is in your admin menus and your custom fields. And then I also had a little bit of that UX background. So I was building the pages in a way that also made sense and was also really facilitated that, ease of entering content, because there's a balance, between you want it to be flexible, but you also don't want the admin to be spending all their time typing things into these discrete, little fields that don't necessarily need to be discrete. So that's also something that I learned. You got to find the balance, and it depends on the client and it depends on the project.
Right. Hey, I have a feeling that a lot of what you're just talking about might fit into this, but one thing I wanted to make sure I asked you about, you use the term, I think it's in an upcoming talk that you're doing about, that you have this framework for implementing content strategy. Now, all this stuff you've talked about, there's a lot of many good lessons in there and good examples of what you've done, but have you articulated this as like a framework that you actually hang projects on, or how does that,
So I have, helping someone else build and manage their content strategy is one thing, but then being the person that needs to use your own content strategy is a whole nother thing. So while I am very good at taking clients through this process of finding their content and figuring out their governance and their process for keeping and maintaining it. That wasn't something that I really ever had to do myself. So now that I'm at Sitelock, I'm doing a lot of content. We are writing a lot of blog posts, and I've learned a lot where I was like, wow, I have these unique challenges now that I've never thought of before, because I wasn't literally in the seat of one of my clients. So yes, now that I have both of these sort of experiences, it's gotten a little bit more complex, I guess, because I understand a lot more different situations. The situations I've encountered in my marketing department are situations that I never encountered with a client, and that's possibly because I never knew the questions to ask. I never knew how to identify those issues they were having. So my talk, especially my talk coming up, that's going to be at WP Campus in July, is not necessarily talking content strategy from a content marketing perspective. It's talking about figuring out how to get that content created within your organization. And in higher ed, there are so many more things that get in the way of you. Like governance is a huge thing in higher ed. Tracking down everyone in all the departments and making sure that people have, time to write about things. And even like not every department is the English department that is going to be gung-ho about writing these things. So this talk is going to be on rallying everybody, understanding that it is a process that is unique to your organization, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through a discovery process that allows each person to discover for themselves how this is going to work, each of these sort of steps. So that's pretty much what I'm going to be doing there, because I've learned that I can't just tell you, do this, then do this, then do this, then do this, and it's going to suddenly work, because that's not the case. And on top of that, as I'm really learning at Sitelock, is that content strategy is best when it's approached as an agile sort of process. So that means it's okay if something isn't working. It's okay to reevaluate and try something else. You're not locked into something just because at the very beginning you thought that it would probably work. And if it's not working, try something else. You don't want to be locked into doing something that doesn't work, because ultimately people are not going to do it. This is sort of like a project management rule, is the best tool for the job is the one that people are going to actually use. So being able to adapt when things aren't working and trying things that can work better, those are sort of the two things that I cover in it.
Got it. Okay. I just noticed we're coming up on time, but I want to give you, I just want to make sure we covered everything. Like, is there anything last that we didn't talk about or that's been on your mind lately that you'd like to share with our folks while we're...
Well, I was sort of talking about the WP Campus workshop, which I'm very excited about. One of my good friends, Rachel Cherry, is putting that on. And it's going to be in St. Louis, July 12th through the 14th. And it's a WordPress-specific, higher ed-specific conference. And I'm very excited about it. And I'm doing a 4-hour workshop that is going to guide people, all the attendees, through finding their own content strategy and learning what they can and what I can teach about that. So I'm super excited about that coming up. And I'm a community evangelist for Sitelock, and my life has changed a lot since I joined Sitelock. Not just the fact that I'm now on a marketing team, which I've never been on a marketing team before, and that I'm doing all of this sort of content strategy on myself, but I'm also doing a lot of travel. I'm going to a lot more conferences than I ever did. I've always loved going to conferences and talking at conferences. But I'm going to a few a month now. And so it's like an exciting whirlwind. We're sponsoring a lot of events. I'm talking at a lot of things. I'm meeting tons and tons of people, like customers and people that have had good and bad experiences. And that's a super new thing for me, and I'm really enjoying it. So I feel like very fortunate at this point in my career that all of these things that I've been doing have, come to this point, and I have the opportunity to be in such a dynamic role now. That's very different from what I've done in the past.
Yeah, no, you've had an interest. You like everybody I've talked to has had like some kind of crazy. A lot of people have like been doing the same thing for 20 years. They just all of a sudden got labeled content strategist. But you've actually done a lot of different things, but content has been this sort of.
I was chasing that role. I was like, this is what I need to do. This is what I want to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. Well, good. Well, thanks so much, Jamie. This is a really great conversation. Really enjoyed talking with you, and hope to see you at a WordCamp or another event soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another content strategy interview.